Okay, I've now played a bunch of this new Civ 7 Test of Time build, and it feels genuinely pretty good to play, with some question marks. So let's explore how the big updates play in practice, not just on paper. From one-civ through the ages to the new triumphant victories, here is the evolved version of Civilization 7. The big question now then is simple. Do the changes that we're about to talk about make Civ a better game to play? Let's start with a biggie. Playing and staying as one civilization throughout a whole game. Right from the start, the game feels more open. New menus, new options, and of course, that consistent Civ ability. In practice, this ability to play as one Civ, regardless of its previous age category, massively expands the playable options immediately. And obviously, this gives us the ability to keep playing as the same Civ through an age transition. In this case, I'm playing as Prussia through the ages. As a previously modern age Civ, I won't reach what's now called my apex age until the third of the three ages. That is Prussia's apex age, because that's the age where it was historically most relevant. It's also where I'd get all of my unique civics, units, buildings, and improvements that my Civ would have typically got in Civ 7. As I'm playing Russia outside of its apex age, two key things emerge. There's the optional Test of Valor event, challenge, and then there's the Syncretism mechanic. Firstly, let's start with the Test of Valor. In practice, this gives you an optional tradition card that you can run for 10 turns. It nerfs your yields and your combat strength throughout those turns, and once it runs its course, you get a reward. Moving along, the reward is a tradition, so it competes with every other tradition card that you have from previous tradition slots, previous whatever action you've taken. Obviously, not so much of an issue in the first age. Policies can also go in tradition slots, by the way, but not vice versa, which makes these slots the most in-demand slots, and that is important context. The benefits of the test card change depending on your Civ, and they generally seem to reflect a sort of slightly dumbed down or generic bonus suited to your Civ's core attributes, taken from that obvious list of attributes: militarism, expansionism, science, culture, the 6 core ones that we've talked about before. In my Prussian case, I got +1 production on all warehouse buildings, a really nice, easy-to-use buff, and frankly, a much-needed boost for a warehouse-laden empire, particularly in the early game. This part feels like a pretty straightforward system to use, and a decent little buff for any Civ playing outside of its apex. It may be less useful in later ages though, as policy card demands become more important. Empires with lower happiness and fewer celebrations will also feel this trade-off much more than others. Either way, I like the Test of Valor mechanic in principle as a simple buff. It just feels a little strange to be nerfed at the very start of a game. I can't help but think, I'm starting as Prussia, why am I being punished with a Test of Valor? I've only just got here, just like everyone else. Moving along, however, to perhaps a slightly more controversial, or at least complex part of this one Civ through the ages system, what they're calling Syncretism. This is the other key thing that a Civ gets when it's playing outside of its apex age, and it's clearly doing a lot of the heavy lifting in making one Civ feel viable and competitive. This is the mechanic where you borrow one unique unit or one unique infrastructure set from another Civ in its apex age. What's on offer is determined by 3 things: the age that you are in, obviously, as well as your Civ and your leader. In other words, you get to add something to your Civ, a complementary piece to be added in to what you already have. It's something age-specific. It's borrowed from a relevant Civ that would be in its prime, and a Civ that's historically or geographically tied to you in some way. In my Antiquity Age Prussian example, playing as Friedrich of course, I was offered stuff from Egypt or Rome. It makes sense. Then in the Exploration Age, I was offered units or infrastructure from the Normans or the Spanish Empire. Again, it makes sense, it's flavorful, it's a subtle addition that's not too difficult to manage. It does, of course, open up a whole load of branching possibilities. In a separate game, I played as Caesar, with Carthage as my one Civ through the ages. This time-spanning Carthaginian run saw me turn into literal pirates in the Exploration Age, or at least somewhat. Playing as a seafaring Civ, I was able to adopt the Republic of Pirates' unique unit, the sloop, A boat capable of piracy at the high seas, of course, regardless of your war status. So, my still Carthaginian empire evolved into the age of exploration by naturally turning a little bit more towards piracy. And I loved it. It felt like a great example of syncretism working in practice. More broadly, the system feels like a great middle ground between the harsher civ switching of Civ 7 and the traditional approach of older civ games, where you play as one more stagnant civ throughout the entire game. It encourages some evolution and change through the ages while still letting you keep a core civ throughout an entire campaign. That said, I do worry some of the implementation is slightly overcomplicated. Maybe the test of Valor doesn't need to be a policy card at all. Maybe it could just be an event where you make the decision to do it or not, and that blocks the policy slot. I also wonder if syncretism is trying to do too much all at once. And another risk feels obvious here too. If syncretism is overtuned, it becomes a min-max magnet. People will simply pick the best option every time, and the flavor will disappear. So what feels fun and fresh initially turns into a pretty set-piece function of a fairly restricted metagame. Fundamentally though, don't get me wrong, I really like the direction here. As someone who is personally skeptical, and honestly not even all that bothered about Civ having ages, or Civ switching more broadly, I was, questioning how this might play out. I didn't want it to just be Civ 6 again. I can go and play that if I want to anyways. I think the upside here is very real. It adds variety, it gives you hybrid builds, it helps the one-civ route feel a little bit more Civ 7-esque. It's adaptive instead of just restrictive. I'm not trying to be down on the mechanic, I just think that there's going to be a lot of tuning and potentially some big balance concerns that will reveal themselves here as it continues to evolve. Of course, time will tell. Now, moving on to Chapter 2, let's talk Triumphs, because this might be the cleanest win of the entire build. Triumphs replace legacy paths, and they are one of the strongest changes across the board as far as I'm concerned. They give structure without making the game feel like a compulsory railroaded checklist. Instead of following the rigid paths of old, you now choose between broader objectives. A broader set of objectives that support all different kinds of play. In this run that mattered a lot because I wasn't just progressing through an age, I was actually trying to build a cultural game with consistent priorities throughout. Now, an important detail here is the split between minor triumphs and major triumphs and how they work in practice. Minor triumphs are your immediate rewards within the age. These are the ones that often help with short-term momentum, stabilizing a position, pushing an advantage, or helping you to hit a timing window. In many ways, they feel like win more bonuses, catering to broad gameplay paths from expansion to science and boosting you in that direction that you were already heading. They're good tempo boosts that tend to reward skilled play or sometimes unusual, unorthodox play, like working every natural wonder or being at war with everyone. Then there are the major triumphs, the bigger, long-term set pieces to replace the legacy paths. Major triumphs present challenges, and completing them unlocks dedications for the next age. It uses that familiar structure of legacy unlocks, but in a much better, broader package. In this cultural Prussian run, as in every run I've played, the triumph structure feels much better than the old do the expected path stuff. I still had direction, but much more room to prioritize. The goals are broader and non-compulsory, and the penalty for building, say, one less wonder than an arbitrary number is far, far less pronounced, almost gone away entirely. And that means that the challenges here are much different than they were with legacy paths. It's about considering many things at once. What's going to help me right now? What's going to set up for the next stage well? And what could support my overall campaign? This ties in very heavily with Victories as well, of course, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But firstly, there were also some Triumph sets available in this build. The sets were kind of rule sets around which Triumphs you would have or how you could earn them. For example, it made some of them single use. First player to get them gets the reward, no one else can. There was also a special military triumph set with special military-focused objectives, including some unique ones to that set. Unfortunately, because they were buried in the advanced options, and because the workshop is only available for a very limited time, I wouldn't be surprised if most of us simply missed out on trying these altogether. And as a side note, I think that settings like these, and the crises on and off toggles, should be promoted out of the advanced settings and into a more obvious or accessible place. They matter a lot and they shouldn't be missed. And Firaxis has already done some nice things to the game setup settings, the UI, the overall thing here, and I think they could add this into the shtick as well. So hopefully that kind of development continues. Overall though, I think the Triumphs are the clearest, easiest example of an update that makes Civ 7 feel less sandboxy, without losing focus. Now on to Victories. One of the biggest improvements of this Test of Time beta update is the victory condition. It's not just the Triumphs that are a great success, I think these are too. The real issue for Civ 7 before was, ultimately, the victories kind of came out of nowhere. The earlier ages didn't feel to have any meaningful setup toward them other than just, increasing your yields. Too much of a campaign felt like general setup, and then much later in the game became, a victory race. Early actions didn't matter. And with a slight exception of the scientific space race, victories in Civ 7 now act much more like continuous victory pathways. You're rewarded throughout with a points-tracked system for the important things you achieve throughout a game. Whether that's economic activity like resources, trade, treasure convoys, and factories, or your cultural progression, earlier actions count now too. They have meaningful impact on a victory. In my build, my cultural run felt like it had real synergy across the campaign. I build wonders, separately from triumph challenges, and I'm rewarded for having these cultural beacons. Every wonder contributes to my victory tourism score, adding to that overall total support. So too do relics, great works, past celebrations, so much more. It feels genuinely great to build a cultural empire, perhaps almost my favorite Civ rendition of the cultural victory to date. Obviously, the UI, like in many places, but especially here, is very much a work in progress. It desperately needs to display all competing empires on the same screen, rather than having a long scrolling list, plus maybe a little bit of extra info. But the underlying system feels fantastic. The points-based tuning of the military victory feels good too, by the way, rewarding capital capture and overall expansion, as well as other nuances that it always had, like ideology in the later ages, feels like a really solid win. I'm less convinced by the scientific-based objectives that have been added in. There, the points feel maybe a little bit like a distraction, but I can still be convinced on this fourth victory category too. Overall, everything feels more transparent. I can track how many points I need, potentially win the game early on in the exploration age if I manage to massively outweigh everyone else. It currently stands at a pretty impossible feeling 9 times the score of the next possible player, or the closest player. But that thankfully cools off to a much more modest 1.5 times in the modern age, in the later reaches of the age, I should say. Those values will probably see tuning over time. I'd love to see these changes in Civ 7 though, like tomorrow, honestly. The same goes for Triumphs. Both feel like easy wins and fundamental improvements to the game. The overall vibes are pretty good here, and are supported by some not so stealthy balancing across the board. The huge balance pass continues. This time saw towns mostly being upgraded and fleshed out. It saw happiness overall adjusted, as well as actually generic yield bloat across the board. Same for specialists and adjacency bonuses. Lots of stuff is going on behind the scenes to rebalance this game. One example, there was the removal of the happiness penalty cap around the settlement limits. It used to stop at -35 per settlement, now it's unlimited. There are plenty more examples, and balance, I know, will never be perfect in a Civ game. To be honest, I don't really want that. I don't really expect that. I like that Firaxis are leaning into the asymmetrical Civ design, and I hope that we see more of that moving forward. My point here is that the balance vibes continue to change. The metagame continues to change. So, after multiple runs here, here's my short version, my quick take. The one-civ option is a huge improvement for campaign identity, and a really nice middle ground between that two sort of divergent camps, right? On the one hand, you have the, I just want this to play like Civilization 6, give me the classic experience and nothing else. And then on the other side, you have the Civ 7 shouldn't change at all, it needs to be its own thing, and I think this is actually a very interesting and pretty effective middle ground, and a nice change for the game. Triumphs are a much better system than legacy paths. Victories feel more present and much better integrated into the earlier and mid-game than before. And those balance and pacing changes continue to be good first steps towards shaping an overall balanced but asymmetrical design for Civ 7. It's clear that what still needs work here mostly is stuff like tuning, polish, and the UI, as well as broader civ support and functionality across the new systems. Syncretism is probably the biggest question mark for me. There are balance cases that I fear will need much more testing. The number of options are simply outstanding. Obviously, UI clarity is still pretty rough here in many places too, and I really want to see how the AI behavior holds up with all of this at scale. Overall, my early impressions though are fundamentally, so far, so good. So what's next? Well, as we've talked about many times, but I should repeat it again for the people in the back, this is a work in progress. This particular case is, of course, the Firaxis Feature Workshop Round 2, running roughly in the last week of February 2026, and Firaxis has been clear that this is still a work in progress, and they continue to gather feedback and iterate. The broader Test of Time update is still being framed for a spring release, though we're yet to receive a more contemporary update on that, and no locked-in date has been given. And honestly, after multiple runs on this version, my biggest issue is that I kind of don't really want to go back to playing the normal version of Civ 7 here on my PC. I want to keep playing this build, and I suppose that's got to be a good sign. My personal take is, if Firaxis can do it, I'd love to see this roll out to a broader audience. Some kind of wider public testing option available before it fully rolls out. Preferably comfortably before it fully rolls out, because things take time. Perhaps that could be a Steam beta branch, an opt-in public test build, even a limited public kind of demo version, if you will. I don't know. There are surely lots of options, and I'd love to see a broader one rolled out, because updates like this get better with more players testing them. Not invite a friend, here are some extra keys, tacked on to extra keys, tacked on, but actually a proper big old playtest. More balanced feedback. More edge cases to be tried and tested, and more examples of what's actually fun versus what might sound good in theory but doesn't really play out in practice. If you were part of this build, or even if you're just observing the changes from the sidelines, following along, maybe you were disinterested in Civ 7 and now you're sort of scratching your head thinking, could this be it? Regardless, I would love to hear from you in the comments of this video. I'll be watching them and reading them very closely. Please, let me know what landed best for you in this version of Civ 7, in this really evolved version of the game. One-civ, syncretism, triumphs, victories, balance pass, I don't care. I really want to know what you think. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.